We're going to speak today about the spiritual importance of crisis in general, and we are in a moment of crisis, but we were confronted with many moments of crisis in our life, and we can learn a lot from this unique moment. Now, you see, any moment of crisis in one's own life is actually an antagonistic relationship, a relationship of two contrary forces within one's own being that create a certain form of tension. Otherwise, usually an inner configuration that creates this tension is a crisis between the forces of good and evil within us. We are torn by these forces, and otherwise it is produced an inner crisis. Or in this case, we are brought into an outer crisis due to the unique configuration of the period which we are in. Now, you see, in front of the energies of crisis, there are two fundamental actions or two fundamental attitudes that we can take. One is the complete, I'm not looking at it, I'm resisting it, and the one of looking at it as a potential way of transforming. And of course, now we will look at it as a potential way of transforming, because one of the beauties of this crisis is that we cannot do much on the outer, seemingly. Always we can do, but it's very much on the inner. And we aim very much in this period to mobilize very well our inner energies. And this is done through the understanding of the A, what is a crisis, and B, the spiritual value of such a crisis. Now, a crisis, if wisely integrated, provides us with the unique ability of creating a spiritual leap. Spiritual leap indicates that we are on one level of consciousness, we have our perspective, our way of seeing reality from one level, and then we have, through a process of crisis and through churning and triumphing, we are then catapulted to a superior state. Now, these unique moments of crisis, which we are now confronted as a society, when we can then take in and wisely integrate it as an individual, represents this possibility of creating the spiritual leap. But what are the wise ways in which we can integrate this? There are many of them, but we will reach to them a bit later on. Now, what actually makes it so that a crisis has such a unique value? You see, we are often confined with a certain comfort zone. Otherwise, we construct a reality of the known. A reality of the known is a reality in which we understand all the elements and we just live day by day with the known aspects of our life. If you will just project yourself 2-3 months ago, in which everything was in the known, you knew what you're going to do tomorrow, you knew your work, you knew how you will spend your days, everything was part of the known. Otherwise, everything was part of also a certain kind of comfort. This is why we often call it the comfort zone. Interestingly enough, within the comfort zone, there is very little challenges, there is very little friction, thus there will appear also very little transformation. A crisis like this represents a massive challenge because it is completely outside our comfort zone. We have very little of the known. It's very interesting, even the fact that you cannot plan anything for next week. You don't know what actually will happen, or planning now for 2 months' time, seeming like gambling on the lottery. Who knows what will be in 2 months' time? Now, in front of the unknown, often our mind and the kind of the formation of that which is enjoying very much the known, the certain formation of our egotic structure, is blocked when confronted with the unknown. In the known, we know what we are dealing with. It's a linear way. When we jump into the unknown, it's a completely new setup. And actually, from the spiritual perspective, it invites us to transform. It invites us to reconfigure the way we are. And any process of transformation exists in or outside the comfort zone, in the unknown, where we often say this is where the magic is happening. Now, it is very interesting the way we are relating to crisis and to challenges, and often our false, I would say, relationship with challenges and false relationship thus with crisis, in which we aim to blame, or otherwise we aim to mobilize our attention towards exterior instead of the interior. You see, in such a moment of crisis, such a moment in which the comfort zone and all our inner configuration is, well, so much out of it, we are, if we wisely take it, we are invited to reinvent ourselves. And the process of transformation, the process of growth, implies a constant reinvention of ourselves. Now, if we, instead of reinvent ourselves, we are being very busy in protecting the comfort zone, which is now very difficult to protect, what we will find is a greater sense of anxiety, stress, fear, depression, and so forth, which I would even dare say that we will find that in the end of this period, the amount of people suffering from anxiety, depression, difficulties within, rising level of suicide will be even greater as an impact on society than the virus itself on the longer term. And this is because we have a very bad relationship with challenges and transformation. We have a very bad relationship with the energy of crisis. Now, it's very interesting if we will actually look at crisis, because we were all experiencing quite a few crises in our life if we look back, and they were actually very meaningful and very beneficial. One of the probably the first examples of a crisis that we were all part of is the moment of birth. In the moment of birth, just imagine that. I know it's very hard to remember that, but you were still conscious. There was a level of consciousness there. It's not that consciousness appears just when you're popping out from the belly. There was some consciousness there, and you were in a very dark, very quiet, protected, warm, nourished place. And there appears life begins with a huge crisis. This is why we cry when we go out. You know, whoa, 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 what's going on? It's painful. You have to crawl out. There's light. You never saw light in your life. You are getting spanked in the buttocks, everything. At first moment of crisis. So our life started with a crisis. Our life is actually integrated within it already, the idea of it's constantly transforming. And then we are confronted with many psychological crises. We have the very famous, longer or shorter, depending on ourselves and our environment, the crisis of puberty. In any crisis, you are there in the state, you don't know how to, you're not anymore a child, you're neither an adult, and you are in an intermediary phase of an inner crisis. There are many antagonistic forces within you, which creates also an antagonistic relationship with those around you, especially with the parents, with the institution, and so forth. Those moments are crucial for the transformation of us as individuals. Then why won't it be that even this moment of crisis could have the same valuable results? Now, those crises, okay, you say, yeah, you know, you have to go through them. We also have to go through this crisis. And I would dare say that this crisis is an invitation for a massive growth, both of individual and globally. We will talk more about the connection between individual and global in the end. Now, exactly what forms a crisis? A crisis is formed of three distinct stages. In the first stage, in the rising sense, appears those two forces, I said these two antagonistic forces, which create an increased tension. In the second phase, the tension appears or otherwise rises to a max, and we find those two forces into a certain peak of the unfoldment of a crisis. Now, this could last for a while. Usually, the first phase could last for a week or 2 weeks, depending on which crisis is in it, and the middle or the second phase could last. Even sometimes people are experiencing crisis of like a year of living in a crisis-like state. And then comes the third phase, which is the phase of conclusion. It is the phase in which one will determine if he will either rise to a much superior level or will fall to a much inferior level. Otherwise, after a moment of crisis, there is an impossibility of things to continue exactly the same. Either there will be a superior leap or an inferior degrade. Now, this is why the crisis represents such a massive opportunity, because you have actually the chance to create this massive leap. Otherwise, often the transformation is happening in a very linear, sometimes pretty gradual unfolding. In this process, we will have this leap possibility that will enable us to enter in superior realms. Or if we don't take it, we will have a downwards. And you see often many people, which they have a fall after a crisis. And so many people, you know, they were having great state, very happy and so forth. They confronted a crisis in their life. For example, a relationship that has ended. And instead of rising, taking it as a beneficial possibility to transform, there was a huge fall in their spiritual level, otherwise a huge fall in the level of happiness, joy, spiritual transformation, and so forth. Now, there is also a mechanism that often happens to people. Can I repeat what were those two antagonistic forces that create tension? The two antagonistic forces that create tension within the human being is the forces of the superior and the inferior, the forces that rises and the forces that descends. You can say the two antagonistic forces of the good and evil. Or there are many, those are just kind of main antagonistic forces, but as I said, in puberty, they're the antagonistic forces of being a child and a grown-up. Those are two forces that are kind of creating a tension within them. Now, in a society that hails so much the idea of a status quo, we have a bit of a rejection towards the process of transformation and a rejection due to the process of crisis. Now, you see, crisis represents a great opportunity if we are in a good relationship with the crisis. And if we want to help our society, first of all, we need to have an embodiment of an embracing state of the crisis that we are in. The question by Chrissy, if you can read it on the chat, if people have to go to rock bottom before they ascend. There is a mechanism, but even that, it will manifest only in the second stage of the crisis. So it won't be that in the third stage they will fall and then that will be it. So in the second stage of the crisis, they will have even what is called in spirituality the dark night of the soul. They will have a moment in which the crisis reaches to such a depth in which they cannot stand it anymore, and out of it they will rise. If you want a very good example of this, I would warmly recommend you to read the introduction to The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, which he described exactly that process of crisis. Massive inner crisis. He was there in a bench somewhere in Europe, realizing he cannot stand himself. He asked himself, who cannot stand who? He reached to such a level of crisis, out of it came the rebirth. And I intentionally use the term rebirth because any process of crisis represents the death of the old and the birth of the new. Now, the death of the old is inevitable. The birth of the new is optional on which form it will take. And this is exactly where we need to bring in the conscious principle so we can mobilize the energies of the crisis towards the beneficial unfolding. Otherwise, just it's crisis, embrace the crisis and let's see what happens. It's a death of the old, let's just go for it. Death of the old, very good. The rebirth of the new, superior or inferior, depending on us. Now, in the energies of the crisis, from the tantric perspective of the Mahavidyas, the perspective of the 10 cosmic powers, they said that they're manifesting three forces, essentially, mainly, because all of them are always intertwined, but three forces mainly that creates that. They said that the cosmic mother called Kali, the mother of time and transformation, is responsible for any process of crisis, both on a global scale and an individual scale, especially an aspect called Dakshina Kali. And this aspect is the aspect that has within it, it is the force of the creator that impels us towards transformation. Now, often this force that impels us towards transformation is a bit confronting for us, because sometimes we want to sleep and that manifests as the alarm clock. Sometimes we want to stay the same, and this is the power that pushes us from behind. And exactly that is the power that creates crises. The crises are given for us to impel us to transform. Another force that comes into display is the power of what we call bagalamukhi, or the power of stopping. This is an aspect of the consciousness of the Supreme that enables the stop of any process of unfoldment so it can transform into superior levels. Now, how exactly this manifests in a process of crisis? Imagine that you are you remember those trains, big trains and small trains work on the same way. They just go on two tracks, you know? And they cannot, a train is not like a car that can just turn right. It goes on the tracks. But each train can also have a movement because there is this leverage there that can shift at where the tracks are going, left or right accordingly. There is a power of the creator, which is called bagalamukhi, that sits in those moments, which we call moments of hiatus, moments of possibilities, of stopping of a certain kind of routine, a certain kind of movement. And there is a power there that sits on the leverage that can shift it from one side to the other. Now, imagine that our train is now going and we are about to hit that. We are in that process of crisis. There is a moment of decision in which you take the leverage in your hand and you move it to where you want this train to go. And it's very interesting. If you don't take the movement, then the train will just keep on going in circles. This is why a crisis represents an opportunity. Because in a moment of crisis, you are there and you have the possibility of pulling the lever. Now, it's interesting. You need to pull the leverage only when the train is there. So it's an auspicious moment. Maybe the train is there every 7 years, who knows? So in that moment, you need to be in the right time, in the right place to pull it. If you're not there in the right time, in the right place, the train left, you can pull it back and forth. The train is already in another circuit, you need to catch it. So this is the second power that is in the game. The third power that is the game is the power which is called Tripura Bhairavi. It is the power of immense focus. And a period of crisis is actually representing for us the ability of ignoring all that which is worth being ignored. It's called the power of frontal ignorance. It's the power that we can ignore all that which is unnecessary. I mean, look at this period. We can actually choose what is necessary and what is not necessary in our life. And we see, okay, we can be home, we can do all these things, whatever. And actually what is really necessary is our ability to be quiet. Isn't it very interesting that in this period, one of the, I would say, the biggest necessities is to be one's own good friend, is the ability of being quiet with one's own self. And you realize that all those years you thought that so many things are actually a necessity and you ignored that. And now you realize, I should ignore that. That is actually now when I'm in this crisis is one of the things that I need the most. So in this period, we will have somehow the possibility of reevaluating our life, ignoring that which needs to be ignored, which is very valuable, and focusing on that which needs our focus. Because anyhow, any moment we ignore some things and focus on other things, usually the process is completely sporadic, and now we have the chance of moving it from a sporadic process to a conscious one. Now, I invite you to a bit of a thought experiment. Now, when I started to write this, I was thinking about moments of crisis in my life. I mean, had previous moments, whatever, parents' divorce, puberty, there were many moments of crisis, and I was just kind of contemplating them. And I was realizing in each moment of crisis, there was a unique potential of transformation. And I invite you to do it after we finish here, contemplate your life and look at moments of crisis that appeared and what was born out of those crises. Now, I remember one moment which was for me very clear. It was in the summer of 2007. In the summer of 2007, it was a relationship crisis. Those are very good crises to relate to in the process of transformation. I was confronted with a huge crisis. I was very jealous. It was a very complex structure. We had fights, and I was seriously confronted with a crisis. It was difficult for me to sleep at night. It was hard for me with myself. I didn't like myself. I didn't like her. I loved her. It was exactly as we said in the beginning, many antagonistic forces I felt within me. There was a lot of forces that were battling one another. And I remember the first thing I did as a man, I tried to ignore the fact that I'm in a crisis. It didn't work. Second thing I tried to do, I tried to sit with it and just deal with it with myself. It didn't work either. Then I started to look for help, which was a big thing. And I spoke with one of my good friends, his name is Arthur, and I had with him a very lively conversation about it. And I realized what happened in the conversation. Now I'm speaking in hindsight. I looked at that, and then what happened in the conversation, I stopped looking at the crisis as being, oh, I'm a little victim. Life is so hard. Life is punishing me. You know, whiny approach. And I started to say, whoa, this crisis that is now happening is a great chance to transform. I am on a path that calls for transformation. I have been an idiot. This is why I'm suffering like a dog. Why am I doing that? Realizing, okay, I have all this pattern that came to this crisis. Let's do something meaningful about it. And I remember just that talk, which was no longer than an hour, in which I shifted completely my inner state regarding the situation. The situation stayed exactly the same. My lover at the time liked somebody which is not me, outrageous. The situation stayed exactly the same. I completely shifted the way I looked at it. And then the situation became from a curse to a blessing. It became from something that helped me transform, helped our relationship grow, enabled me to shift completely my inner configuration, catapulted me to unique spiritual state. I remember one morning after I had this epiphany, I went in sunrise to the sea, and I remember diving in the water and feeling how I'm in bath with God's light. And then I realized in that moment when I was swimming in this ocean of pure luminosity, that state that I had was because I managed to overcome a crisis. And my relationship with the crisis back then radically changed. Now, I invite you now, I'm sure many of us are to a certain extent in a crisis now, some more than others, depending on our inner configuration. I know, for example, my father, who is in this talk, he's enjoying very much. Now he has lots of time to meditate and practice, but I know other people which are not pensioners, they're maybe a bit more concerned about work and all these other things. But for those which, if you are in the process of crisis, this is exactly an invitation for you. Hey, what am I here to learn? Even visualize yourself. Often I like this, the idea of the birth of a butterfly. Visualize yourself as a caterpillar. You're in the caterpillar, and it's a crisis. You're all churning there inside, and you're crashing. And realize and remember that in this existential crisis that I am in now, a butterfly is born. And this relationship with that crisis will already create this impetus that will help us to overcome the crisis. This is why one of the great help in the crisis is to be very attentive to our intentions and our thoughts, because they create our reality. And by shifting our intention, by shifting our relationship from being a victim to an opportunity, we are having this possibility of massively learning and growing. Now, we will speak about 4 fundamental qualities which could massively help us in our relationship with crisis, and specifically in this period. The first of the valuable qualities is the quality of optimism. Now, the quality of optimism should not be confused with the concept of being naive. Optimism is actually a soulful perspective upon our life. You see, when we see from the heart, when we have not just the eyes of the mind that constantly divide and linearly put, trying to arrange reality, and we see the things from there, when we have this genuine, what we call rightful hopes, we will see the reality in its most wonderful light. Otherwise, we will be able to extrapolate from any circumstance what we can learn and what is the potential of growth from that. This is actually one of the qualities of an optimistic. An optimistic doesn't look and says, economy crashed, people are unemployed. That's great. I think we need to mute some of the people here. What an optimistic person will do, you say, whoa, this is happening. Come out of here. What good can come out? And then gradually you look at all the things and say, what good can come out of here? And you put all your energies, you put all your attention to the blossoming of that good. You see, pessimism is a default. Optimism is a choice. Is a reflection or it's a manifestation of the consciousness. Optimism is this unique ability for us to nurture that beneficial parts of reality. It doesn't mean that we ignore the parts which are seemingly not beneficial, but by putting, we can say, more attention, by feeding that which is beneficial, that will grow. This is why the optimistic, also his life is so much more rich, because as we all know also now from quantum mechanics, our awareness influences life. What we put in life is the way life unfolds around us, and how it is happening. The optimistic always feeds those good seeds and they will grow. And because he doesn't feed those negative seeds, they will gradually wither. And this is the way an optimistic person radically transforms his life. He's not ignoring, he's just choosing what to feed. And that is the way an optimist radically changes his life. And especially in this period, what else can you do by being optimistic? I mean, I was thinking a lot about it. I'm seeing a little bit of television and all the things. People are so much inner confrontation and so many difficulties. I mean, if in these periods we wither and we become as pessimistic as the news are, we are doomed as people. And I saw many people falling into severe anxieties, depression, inattention. And this is because those seeds were there of course, you lost your job, you're in a complex situation, you cannot leave the house, you eat very regularly, 30 meals a day, all the complexity of being in quarantine. And exactly then, when an optimistic view appears, you start to feed the beneficial aspect. For example, now I can meditate more. Now I can put some more attention to this aspect. Let me feed this, let me do that. Let me awaken my kindness and see how my neighbor is, and so forth. This is a reflection of an optimistic perspective. The second valuable quality that we ought to awaken in this period is the wonderful quality of courage. Courage, which actually is very interestingly taken from the French word cœur, which means heart, and rage means an impetus. It is representing this quality of courage, represents a certain kind of impetus of the heart. And it is very interesting that in any process of crisis, if we assume it, otherwise if we genuinely take it in, we will then manifest a great force of courage, an impetus of courage that will enable us to mobilize an enormous amount of energy, otherwise an enormous amount of inner resources. If we will look at the course of history, it was always painted, it was always weaved by courageous people. And those courageous people were not different than us 60 people here. The difference was that they were able to mobilize all their energies because they realized it is a crisis, they realized the importance, they realized the value of what they're doing, and thus they were having the ability of mobilizing their energies. Courage enables us to mobilize all our potentials. And this is how we can massively influence the reality, the life we live in. And especially in a moment of crisis, as I said beforehand, we have now the possibility of removing the old. Otherwise, the ability of releasing the old, the ability of letting the old die without lingering on it, it takes an enormous courage. It's a leap of faith when you are, as a caterpillar, you shed the shell and you rise as a butterfly. I mean, many caterpillars stayed caterpillars. They didn't have the courage, they weren't able to mobilize all their energies to create this leap. This is why it is so valuable to have this wonderful leap and to mobilize our energies to their full. The third quality, you need to admit somebody. The third quality that is needed is the quality of self-discipline. Self-discipline literally means the ability of being a disciple of one's own self. Now, a disciple of one's own self doesn't mean that is just the whole path is autodidactic and I don't need anybody. But it means, especially in this period, to be a disciple of all the acquired ideals, all the acquired principles, all the acquired inner realization, and to align yourself accordingly. You see, in such a period when we are very much alone and we don't have so much impulse from the outer world, except Zoom. Here on Tara, we keep you very busy with our Zoom webinars, Facebook Live, extra classes. I mean, you have some reminders. Nevertheless, most of the day you are by yourself. And then often it's very difficult to connect to what should I align with? How should I integrate my life? And self-discipline is the quality that enables us to be a disciple of our own superior selves. For example, one realizes that one of the things that one believes very much is the practice of meditation daily. Yeah? You practice it daily and you realize it's very important for you. And then now you have not much of a job. You don't have to wake up in the morning. You start to wither away and then you wake up and you are a little bit hungry. So forget about the meditation. Let's start with some cereals. Let's start and we open the phone and we go on Facebook. We forget what happened for 2 hours. Then we remember we need to send an email. And due to the fact that there is no inner coherence, there is no inner disciplines of the remembering, this is something extremely valuable for me, we lose it. And we often know when we lose it is when we contemplate our life and we find certain lack of fulfillment. You know you're very well self-disciplined and a disciple of your own superior self when you have a certain fulfillment that appears daily. It's a fulfillment because you nourish this aspect, the superior aspects within you. This is one of the ways in which we can relate to self-discipline. And the last of the qualities, which is extremely valuable in this time, is the quality of inner dynamism, which is connected to self-discipline. Both of them are related to the third level of consciousness of our being, the third chakra, Manipura, but it is of a distinct aspect. Inner dynamism is our ability of mobilizing ourselves not from an exterior impulse, but from an interior one. Inner dynamism is very much alike aspiration, is our ability of igniting our inner fire that will create an inner mobilization that will enable us to act in an integrated way. Now, interestingly, and I chose it very specifically, I chose these two, discipline and dynamism, even if they are close together, because I noticed from many people which I speak with, this is one of the things they lack the most. So I said, interestingly, we are now confronted with a situation in which we have very little outer sources of dynamism. I mean, we're home. I haven't left. I'm just going home, and like the peak of the week is going shopping. I mean, it's home, Tara teaching, home, and kind of there is a tendency of people to reduce somehow the dynamism in their life because there's no outer stimuli that creates dynamism. That people need to go to work, they need to do this, they need to do that. Now there is I would say the fire within is gradually going lower and lower and lower because there's no exterior stimuli. Now, being dependent on exterior stimuli for dynamism is a false fire that we have within us. This is why in this period, it's exactly the time to find inner motivation and not outer motivation to act. It's exactly the time to mobilize ourselves from within and not to wait for an outer mobilization for us to be dependent on. Inner dynamism is this ability of genuinely moving ourselves from within because we have a certain kind of, we feel this calling of the heart. Inner dynamism comes when we start to listen to the needs, deep needs of our soul, and we realize that those needs are calling for us to be fulfilled. I mean, when we are hungry, you mobilize yourself, at least to go to the fridge nowadays or to go shopping, you know. There is a dynamism that created from that hunger. But that is a very basic. Inner dynamism is that we start to become aware of the hunger, of the needs of our soul. We start to realize them, and they will also call for the dynamism. They will also call for an action. For example, you feel the need of your soul to connect to something higher in this period. I can tell you for myself, I feel now a very big need of my soul to remove myself for a while from technology, to go within, to find a bigger, a deeper state of intimacy with one's own self, to connect more to God, to the Creator, however you want to call it. I feel it. And then it's now dynamizing me, for example, during this weekend, to have 3 days of no technology, 3 days of just spiritual practice of yoga, meditation, reading, writing, 3 days dedicated for that. I have to mobilize myself. Otherwise, I listen to my heart and it calls me, it creates an inner impulse, an inner dynamism towards doing that. And in this period, we are very much called, I would say, to start to listen to those aspects within us. And start to notice how now that there is much less of the outer dynamism, find your inner dynamism. Even, I would say that best workers ever, people who work the best, the most integrated workers, as we call in the yogic tradition, karma yogis, are people who are not dependent on exterior stimuli, but they work from an interior one. And it's not just motivation. It's not just ambition. Motivation and ambition often are only ego related. It's an aspiration. It's a calling. It's an insight. It's an impetus that comes from your heart and mobilizes you to do that. I mean, we all know it when we are very much in love. That's a state. When you are in love, you are called towards that. There is a pulling force. It's a magnetism of the heart. Now, being in love is not just in a person. Being in love is a state of life. And this is exactly what we'll call for this inner dynamism. So to conclude our talk, and then for those who wish to stay longer, we can have some questions and answers. A state of crisis is two antagonistic forces or more inside our being. Any state of crisis will call for either a rise or otherwise a spiritual leap or a spiritual degradation. Any crisis have 3 distinct stages: the build up, the peak, and the conclusion. Any state of crisis, with wisely integrated, otherwise by putting our correct intention, could be used for an acceleration of our spiritual transformation. Crises in general have a main influence of the 3 cosmic powers, as we said, Kali, Matangi, and Tripura by Ravi, and we mentioned then 4 meaningful qualities that will help us: optimism, courage, self-discipline, and inner dynamism. So this is just for us to have an overview. Now, if you have any questions or any comments. You can also unmute your mic.
Ofer, may I?
This is my father. Yes, of course you can.
Okay. So I hope you can see me. I want to make a comment and then to ask a question. My comment is that despite the fact that we are in our houses, and we are really with many limitations, and people have economic problems and so and so. Despite that, many people are feeling a kind of happiness. And this is an interesting point, that somehow the crisis situation brings us to a state of mind of being in the now and here.
Yeah.
And this is also a resource for transformation, that you have this special feeling that allow us to think differently, to move differently, and you have the time to react. And it's right that you have many choices to do, and the self-discipline is really very important in this world. But still, I do agree that the crisis is a big opportunity for change, for reconciliation with our feelings. And I want you to ask especially how you connect this with this feeling that it's really very, very much in the air, at least where I live in Israel, and where the limitations are really sometimes very, very tough. So that's my comment.
So was a comment, or there's also a question there, or just a comment?
The question is, how do you relate the crisis with the change, with the fact that so many people are feeling so well?
How is it? It's a very good point, because one of the reasons why people feel so well, and it's very interesting, as I mentioned, you know, we are kind of in a prison that we kind of signed into. It's called the prison of the comfort zone. And now we're a bit out of it. And actually we find out that outside the comfort zone, this is where the magic happens. And we start to realize that there is a great potential of happiness which exists from the mere state of being. Until now, we were very much convinced that the state of happiness comes from acquiring or comes from only experiences. And more in these periods when we just can be with ourselves, we realize that the state of happiness arises from the natural state of being, as wonderfully spoken about in the yogic tradition as the state of ananda or bliss, the existential joy that is our nature. So one can say that in this period we are being pushed in a way, otherwise more inspired to go towards that inner reality.
When you mentioned being quiet with ourselves, does it mean only meditating, or does it also include watching or reading as long as we don't talk?
When I mean by being quiet with one's own self, is a question here from Neringa. When I mean being quiet with one's own self, it's not necessarily only the outer talk. It's very much the inner conversation, the chatter of the mind. When we are gradually able to reduce this mental chatter and we start to be with ourselves in whatever situation we are with ourselves, we can then relate much better to any situation, and we find ourselves otherwise fed from that. More than this, in this period, we are more with ourselves because there are less social interaction, forbidden by law to interact socially. And you have just the time to confront things within you. You see, it's very interesting. In our world, we constantly look for pacifiers. I know when we were babies, we would put pacifiers so we won't cry. Now our soul is crying and we put constantly pacifiers for us not to deal with it. We call it endless chat, we call it endless socializing, we call it endless agitation. So we will not have to deal with the crying baby, which is us. So in this period, instead of having always the pacifier, look at the crying baby. He cries because he's hungry. Your soul cries because there's not enough love. But come on, feed it with that love. It's up to you, inner dynamism. It's up to you to do it. Courage, jump into the unknown. You see? And instead, now we are we are cut off, we are having a pacifier detox, and now it's time to deal with the crying baby, us. And it's a wonderful opportunity because maybe we can always finally feed the baby instead of just giving him pacifiers until he dies. Another question, how should we do when we feel we are losing our self-discipline and feeling guilty about it? It's a very interesting feeling because you decide to do something and then you beat yourself for not managing to do it. And instead of doing something beneficial, you find yourself in a bigger pit, in a bigger hole. Self-discipline, together with willpower, is developed with a constant rising and choosing aspects that we can do. And it's a build-up of day by day. You don't do it with great leaps. Now, specifically with our ability of self-discipline, one of the great helps I know for myself is to genuinely believe it. Don't take somebody else, they told me it's good to do it, and I need to be now disciplined for that to do it. Check for yourself. After you check for yourself and you're confirmed that this is the good thing for you, you will have the power of being disciplined to one's own self. I checked for myself, whatever, 2003, 17 years ago, I experimented with fasting. I noticed that fasting does me very well. I didn't just heard all my friends saying fasting is good and said, okay, let me fast. No, I tried it myself. I took it to the experiment. I realized fasting is very good for me. So I took a decision to keep fasting at least one day a week. That was in 2003, 17 years ago. And I'm still, when I'm fasting, I'm still a disciple of my own superior self. It's an ideal that I have took within. I said, fasting is good for me. I'm going to continue to do it as long as it's good for me. And then, because it is a self-acquired, it's not outwardly imposed, it's genuinely based within, it's much easier to follow. Often the guilt that appears and the inability of following one's own self is because we haven't fully acquired those ideals within us. We haven't fully digested that which we want to follow. This is why it's hard to follow. Something that you fully digest, something that you fully assimilated, it will become an integral part of you. And you will follow it in a certain ease within. It will still take effort, but there's a certain ease in following it. I hope it answers your question.
Hi, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
It's maybe, first of all, the lecture is excellent. I can relate to all of your talk. I may have a very difficult question, which is how to deal with situation where it's really extreme, where it's power of now, it's essential. Like, let's say it's somebody who is having a cancer, when we are talking days or weeks. Is it possible in those difficult situations to actually apply these rules, or even as me transferring this somehow to the person to help that person? Is that possible, or is that big, really big thing to ask? Because I like to help, and it's really extreme situation, and thank you.
I mean, we cannot help and we cannot give what we haven't assimilated. So first thing is to assimilate this. First thing is to live them. First thing is to take them in. And then through the power of example, we can help other people through our being very well anchored within. We can help the other person. I would like to refer here, and I would warmly recommend you to read a book by Viktor Frankl called Man's Search for Meaning. It's his confrontation with life in a concentration camp. And there he described very much how the human psyche works. And one of the beautiful sayings which he mentions there, that in order to bring light, one must endure burning. Which is, I would say, kind of sums up the whole conversation to a certain extent. So if we want to help someone, Otherwise, somebody is in darkness, is in a very difficult situation. We want to become like a lighthouse for that person. We like to bring them light. But in order to bring light, we need to become a lighthouse. Otherwise, we need to endure the burning. We need to take the challenges. We need to assimilate all those notions. We need to grow to become that. And when we grew to become that, we can then offer a person in such a complicated situation, that majestic light. I would even say that one of the greatest things that we can give to the world in this time is for us to become like lighthouses. I can tell you for myself, the reasons why we are here day in, day out, offering these things, offering this teaching, because we can see that a world in so much darkness is a world that calls for light, and we need to be that. It's a world that calls for lighthouses because there's such stormy weather. And we need to become lighthouses, and you become lighthouse when you endure burning, when you take on you wise, superior decisions, when you align yourself with your ideals, when you mobilize your inner energies, when you practice. This is the way we endure burning. And then we can help people who are in a situation like that. Until then, it's very difficult. I mean, always there is this kindness of the heart, this impetus within, this love that we can always offer. But to really bring that light of consciousness, we need first to endure burning. And a question from Virginia Thierry. Practically speaking, when you are on the second stage of the crisis, when it's in its peak, what you should do to go over it? Oh, you ask if to just wait. No. Simply no. You do not just wait. Just waiting will make it so that you'll have most probably the course of gravity which will bring you down. In that moment, you see that moment with superior intention, embracing the crisis as a possibility to transform, noticing the challenge as an opportunity to grow. You put there wonderful qualities that will impel you instead of going down, so you will be able to catapult and to go up. The just wait, otherwise being a little bit like you put your head in the sand. What's the name of that animal? An ostrich thing. Okay, crisis, put your head in the sand. Let's see when it happens. Past. Well, putting your hand in the sand, waiting for it to pass, it will pass, but you will not pass with it. This is why it is, any process of crisis invites us to grow to our, to the peak of our abilities.
Hi, Fuka.
Hi, Jay.
Let's assume that someone's focus is to grow spiritually and they don't have enough crisis. Shall they fabricate that in an ethical way and then use it to accelerate?
No. You should be very attentive here, because there is kind of this daredevils. Not enough crisis. Let's get some more crisis. Not enough challenges. Let me do. Crisis, challenges are actually the way life constantly causes us to transform. There is an intrinsic wisdom in life. What we ought to do is to live life to the maximum of our intensity, otherwise to meet life with all that we can, and we will notice that the challenges will come in an integrated way. And one will have periods of bigger challenges, lower challenges, different challenges. There are challenges at work, there are challenges in relationship, there are inner challenges, there are challenges of your practice, many forms of challenges. One does not invite the challenge, one does accept it. And it's a very different idea. Because some challenges, if you run too quickly and you're not ready, that challenges will devour you. So take the challenges as they come. Do not jump stages. And life is having that intrinsic wisdom that will give you the challenges when you need them.
Thank you.
Is there any question, more question there? Yeah, Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl. So thank you very much for joining this talk. I remind you that we are a charity here in Tara, and all of us here are enjoying offering this as volunteers. And for those who wish to contribute, we very much appreciate it. It's energetically also very important for us. We feel very much the support of all those who contribute. So those who want, you are most invited just to use the link for the donation. I don't know where it is because my team is doing something, but hopefully it will be there. And we look forward to see you Friday, those who are our members, for a talk about the healing power of plants. And then on Sunday, we will offer for everybody a wonderful talk. It will be a Facebook Live about spiritual nutrition, how we can even use this period to eat wisely and to improve our health. Friday, it will be done with a wonderful teacher and Dr. Magdalena, and on Sunday with my wonderful colleague, Morgan. So thank you very, very much for your attention. It is wonderful to feel you close, even if we are physically apart. And I look forward to see you in our future activities. So again, thank you very much for being part. Next two talks, Friday it will be from 7 to 8 and Sunday from 7 to 8:30. Good then. Then thank you very much, and I look forward to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.